We're going to have a look at the summary of the story of Isabella or the Pot of Basil. So this is going to give you a general overview into the poem. Because it's a super long narrative poem, and in the modern world we're not used to reading long form poetry. At the time that Keats wrote this, it was actually a normal way to consume stories. So his regular readers wouldn't have thought of it as particularly long or tiring or anything like that. But generally, as a modern reader, me included, you might feel like it drags on a little bit, or kind of you get a little bit lost in what's going on in the stanzas because they're very descriptive and very complex. So with anything like that, the best thing to do is start with a summary so you know the story, and then go more into the language and the actual use of the stanzas. So start with the summary before you do anything, basically, and that will help you unlock the poem, and it will make everything clear and you won't get lost. So it's going to be a quick lesson where we just go through what is going on in the story. So firstly, we've got these two characters, Lorenzo and Isabella. They're young Florentines, so they live in Florence. They live in Italy in the medieval era. It's important generally to know that at this time, Italy was not a full country. So the different states of Italy, or the different provinces, are all individual countries kind of in themselves. So being Florentine is different from being Venetian, for example. But in this time, Florence is a very, very rich city. It's one of the richest cities in the world. It's the banking capital of Europe. I used to actually live in Florence for a while, and it's kind of stuck in the medieval era because that was its peak, really. So it's really cool if you ever get a chance to visit Florence and you go back there. It looks like how it would have done in the time of Lorenzo and Isabella. You can look up images of it as well and get a feeling for how the city looks and what the layout is, because it gives you an idea of the sort of setting and environment of the poem. So Isabella's aristocratic. She's rich, she's posh, she's from a fancy family. Her brothers are wealthy. It's kind of slightly ambiguous whether she's aristocratic or whether they're very rich merchants, but either way, they have a very fancy house and their family has a lot of wealth. And this is one of the main barriers to the love between Isabella and Lorenzo. The main idea of why they can't be together is because he's unsuitable, being of a lower class, not being of wealth. So the brothers are very controlling over Isabella. There's no mention of parents, so we assume probably that the parents passed away. And so the brothers, as males of the household, have some sort of authority over Isabella, and they want to marry her off to a rich, well-suited businessman or aristocrat that can preserve wealth of their family and can make good connections for themselves and their business. So we have this tension coming out of the difference between true love, where you sort of marry someone, or you're committed to someone because you actually genuinely have a spiritual, pure connection to them, versus if you just marry someone because your family wants you to, or because of financial reasons, or the idea of sort of creating stability in terms of wealth and status. So Lorenzo is unsuitable because he's employed by one of the brothers. He works for the brothers. I don't know if it's one of them or both actually, but he works for them. So in their eyes, he's lower than them. He's not suitable as a match for her, either financially or in terms of social status. So they're not a good match in terms of society. But as we see, they are a good match in terms of personality and spirituality. So Lorenzo knows he's not worthy of Isabella from a social point of view. So he loves her, but he keeps it a secret, and he loves her from afar. She feels the same towards him, and she represses her feelings for the same reason. So there's this scene where they're crying into their pillows. It's very dramatic. They're crying and they're really sad because they can't stand to not admit their love any longer. They feel so intensely, but that intensity is not allowed, and it makes it worse, I think, because they can't admit their love for one another, and because there's barriers or impositions on who they're allowed to love. So they fall lovesick, and in the medieval era, lovesickness was thought to be a genuine illness. So even though Keats is not writing in the medieval era, he's writing in the 19th century. He's drawing on a story from Boccaccio's Decameron that was written at that time. So all of the different tropes and the initial core of the story comes from that medieval time written by an Italian. So yeah, so they're lovesick. They get really sick and ill because they're not able to express their love for one another. Isabella faintly cries out Lorenzo's name because she sees him and he looks really ill. And just from that one whisper of his name, he realizes that she actually loves him back and it's not just one-sided. So they begin a hidden relationship. So they're trying really hard to oppress their feelings, to respect the society and the rules of the time, and they really can't, and they meet up anyway. They have a hidden relationship, so they meet in trysts, which are kind of lovers' meetings, at dawn and dusk. Night is quite important to the poem because they can't really be seen together in the day, so they're more active at night. So they have this really nice, beautiful moment in their lives, probably the happiest they've ever been. This very brief moment because the brothers catch on to their love. They notice that this is going on and they become jealous and angry. So they conspire. They're conspirators. They kind of work together. They're both evil and they kind of egg each other on, or they sort of, I don't know what the word is, but like they encourage each other or enable each other to do more and more evil things because there's two of them. So they decide they're going to lead Lorenzo into a forest and just brutally murder him. And they tell Isabella that he's gone away to a far off land on some business that they gave him, and eventually they don't think he'll ever return. So she's really sad, she's heartbroken, which again is a physical illness in this time. Her beauty and her youth wither away, so she starts looking less like an eligible maiden that could be married to a rich suitor and more just kind of useless to the brothers, and that becomes important later. So Lorenzo, after he's dead, he visits Isabella in a kind of dream as a ghost. The reality or extent to which the ghost aspect of this is real is sort of personal, down to people's individual beliefs. It was an interest of a lot of people in the 19th century when Keats was writing. They were quite interested in spirits and ghosts and so on, and a lot of people believe that they're real. So it could just be a dream, it could be something real, but there's this idea that there's some connection. Isabella has a feeling that Lorenzo is murdered or something's gone wrong. So he reveals to her in his spirit form that he was buried in a forest tomb. So Isabella gets very kind of panicked and stressed. She gets a maid and they go to the forest and they dig him up. And there's a really quite drawn out, very, very nice, I think, scene, quite gothic and dark, where she's kind of digging up the grave and her hair's like a curtain sort of falling over her face, and it's all kind of very dramatic. Yeah, and quite intense. So she digs him up. She realizes that it's true, and she can't take the whole body back with her, so she severs his head and takes the head back to Florence. And then she keeps it and she cries over it because she doesn't know what else to do. So she's kind of helpless and just in a state of mourning and suffering. Again, mourning, we'll look more at this when we do context, but mourning is an important idea to people in the 19th century. So she really loved him. He's her true love. She can't move on from him. And so she's plunged into a state of suffering and mourning because he's dead and she's still alive. She decides to try and keep this like hidden, the head, because it's a bit obvious, this kind of mouldering head that she has. So what she does is she buries it in a pot and she plants sweet basil, which is just the basil herb that you see in Italy a lot, over the top of it. And most of her time, apart from occasionally to sleep, occasionally to eat, she sits next to this pot and she cries. And because it's watered by her tears and it's fed by the mouldering head of Lorenzo, this basil becomes incredibly beautiful and fragrant. Keats uses words like balmy to describe it, which means it's kind of very rich and sort of sweet smelling. So it's kind of like a crazy thing that there's this kind of very beautiful Basil growing out of the union of Isabella and Lorenzo. In some ways, it's a pretty gross image, but in other ways, it's kind of morbidly naturalistic, because obviously the dead bodies kind of return to the earth, and as they decay, they become soil and they feed new life. So it's sort of a metaphor for the cycle of life and death, or the way that life can spring from death. I think it's also symbolic of the union between Isabella and Lorenzo. So in a normal situation, they would have got married and had children and created something between them. And because they're unable to do that, the basil plant is kind of like a stand-in for what Isabella and Lorenzo are able to create together. So when I teach students this, they're always like, I don't get the basil, like it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't if you think about it literally, but if you think about it symbolically and also how people would view it in the time, hopefully my explanation makes a bit more sense to you about what is so good about the basil, why the basil is interesting. So the brothers, they get confused by this basil because they think, something's wrong with Isabella. She's getting uglier and her beauty is fading. She's looking sick. She's not a very useful tool anymore to marry off to someone. So they realize that the pot contains Lorenzo's head and they steal it. And Isabella gets really, really stressed and confused about why they would take it from her. So she just goes into kind of a hysterical state. She's almost like a raving madwoman by this point, where she can't. They think that it will kind of make her move on and she'll be able to carry on with her life, but she really can't. So she kind of wastes away, being very accusatory, very kind of stressed and lost without the head of Lorenzo. So we've got some interesting ideas here. It's important as well at the end, actually, just to note that the brothers realize that, someone knows that they murdered Lorenzo and they're incriminated. So they run away and they leave the kingdom forever. So Lorenzo and Isabella are very passive figures. They never actively do anything to change the situation or to confront the brothers, who are the kind of active figures. But through the kind of purity and spirituality in their union and their true love for each other, they do eventually in some way win. You can interpret Isabella's death as positive because her spirit is now with Lorenzo's. You can also interpret the fact that she's no longer a tool to be used by them, because it's not about her youth and her beauty anymore, as a form of liberation in her character. And you can see that the evil that the brothers are and representative of gets kind of thrown out of the city because they're so paranoid that people are going to find out that they're murderers, that they kind of run away and they never come back. So without doing anything directly, they indirectly create a kind of positive outcome for Florence, the removal of the brothers, even though tragically the two lovers are dead at the end. So it's really, really similar to Romeo and Juliet, if you've ever studied that. I recommend just learning a little bit of Romeo and Juliet, maybe watching it if you're doing Keats, because he's really into it and it kind of crops up a lot in his poetry. So it helps you understand Keats if you understand a bit of Shakespeare, and especially tragic Shakespeare, and especially Romeo and Juliet out of the tragedies. So that's a little summary of the story. Hopefully that makes sense to you and you can see all the elements there. You might want to just finish this lesson by bullet pointing the key plot points and the key moments where things shift and change in the story, so that you've got a really good, clear outline before you delve into reading the story itself. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in future lessons.